So I had a really unique perspective coming into the therapy world, having gone through my own trauma. I'd kind of seen all of these different systems from a personal lens.
When we get to a place where we're so stuck and we're like, you know what, I really can't do this on my own anymore. I really need some sort of support. The general terminology is you should probably see a therapist.
Trauma doesn't happen in that same way. And for most people, if you've ever gone to a therapist's website, just any clinic near you and look at all the clinicians and then look at their specialties, most have 5, 10, 12 things that they're specializing in. You can't specialize in 12 things.
When you're looking for a therapist, typically you're looking for somebody that's a licensed clinical social worker or a licensed professional counselor or a licensed family therapist. What's
Correct.
the difference between that and a psychotherapist? Welcome back to Flip Your Mindset. I am your host, Stacey Uhrig, and I'm so excited because I have Kyira Wackett back with me today. And guys, if you are new to the podcast, you may not know that Kyira is a recurring guest. If you are a regular, welcome back. But I have created this expert series, if you will, with Kyira. Kyira is a licensed professional counselor, right? Is that accurate? Okay. She is also a trauma therapist. And, you know, there can be a lot of, I don't know if the word is discord or like sometimes like therapists don't love the fact that there are coaches, and there's definitely a stigma in the industry where some therapists may not love the fact that coaches are working in the trauma space. They might think that that's irresponsible. They might find that that's not a good idea. And part of the reason why is because I don't think that they understand, at least from my perspective and the kind of schooling I had, like how in depth the schooling can be for somebody like a trauma coach. I am really proud to say that I'm with the International Association of Trauma Recovery Coaching. And the person who started that is Bobby Parrish. And Bobby was a licensed therapist many times over. And she specialized in family therapy. She has her own amazing background story. And you can actually see that on a past podcast I did with Bobby. So I'll link that here. But what I love about what Bobby created is not only was the content for trauma recovery coaching as in depth as you could get, she required for our credentialing a set of standards that is not so different from the set of standards that licensed professionals need to maintain and keep in order to keep their credentials. So I had to go through exams. I had to go through supervision. I had to go through dyads and triads and practicums. I have to have a certain number of CEUs every 2 years in order to maintain my connection with the association. I have to have a number of supervision hours. So it's really created in alignment with what she had to go through as a therapist. She left therapy because she didn't feel that she could best serve her clients with the knowledge that she had. She had started coaching and ended up coaching from this trauma space. What I love about working with Kyira is that she is a trauma therapist. And we're going to talk today a little bit about what makes a therapist a trauma therapist, because not everybody that is a therapist is trained in trauma, and how we can actually collaborate as practitioners in the mental health space. Right. And so our goal with our expert series is to educate you guys. You know, I'm really passionate about offering low and no cost resources. I feel that mental health should be accessible and available to everyone. And part of that mission is to do things like this podcast, my YouTube channel, my courses, some of my free ebooks to help people start to connect the dots within their own journey. So welcome back, Kyira. How are you?
I am doing good. How are you today?
Good. Today, we were going to talk about how to find the right practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So just as a primer, can you just share with people from your seat, you've mentioned before you're 36, right?
Yeah.
How long ago did you become a therapist?
So I started in 2015 with my master's program. So I've been working in mental health for about 15 years, but I worked on the peer level. So I worked for the National Alliance on Mental Illness and was very much in the what does peer-to-peer support look like? And where do professionals fit into that and where are they getting it wrong? So I had a really unique perspective coming into the therapy world, having gone through my own trauma, my own eating disorder recovery, my own experience with different supports, and my family's kind of movement through the system. My mom struggled with substance use and was in and out of prison and then treatment centers. And so I'd kind of seen all of these different systems from a personal lens. But then working there, I was really wanting to understand kind of the integration of what support can look like. And that being really one of the strongest peer-to-peer based support systems. I worked there and then decided, okay, I want to go in and start learning how to be a therapist and figure out what it looks like to approach it from a slightly different angle, where it is, how do I, again, bring in some of that peer aspect, but also leverage other supports? What do I need to know? And then I went through my training. I actually did an extra year in my training to allow for me to do 2 internship sites. So I think you mentioned practicum. So some people call it practicum, some people internships, because I did one in our community mental health agency where I did a lot more around trauma, family systems. And then I did one specific to eating disorders because that's my other route. And really my primary specialty that I'm known for is more working within the eating disorder side of things. And so then I became licensed in 2018. The interesting thing, which I'm sure we'll get to, is licensure. So counselors, therapists, there's no universal regulatory body in the sense of what it looks like to be licensed in Wisconsin is different than what it looks like to be licensed in Oregon. So when I moved to Oregon, I had to start completely over. That's not the same for social workers. Social workers are like much more deeply rooted. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to like break it out, because what happens is when people finally get the courage and the decision making to go get support and help, the most common thing somebody will say is, you should find a therapist or you should go to therapy.
Right.
And there's a lot of different kinds of people who provide this kind of service. So maybe we can break down this, it's not a hierarchy, but just like what the
different routes.
Feel. Yeah. So can you break that down so people understand that?
So there's basically, when I was looking at becoming a therapist, there was 3 primary routes that you were sort of sent to. Either social work, which is much more, a lot of social workers work in one-on-one settings. A lot of the training is around systems. So understanding whether it is politics and how to lobby and how to advocate for different systems, or really recognizing how systems are creating spaces where people aren't included, where the sort of injustice is coming in. There's much more of that social justice lens that's included in the training within social work programs. So social workers can be amazing one-on-one therapists, and oftentimes in their training, they need to push and pursue that a bit more because that's not the primary lens that their programs will be under.
And so a lot of the times would know that they are a social worker because they would be an MSW, correct?
So they could say MSW. Lots of times it'll say LCSW, so a licensed clinical social worker. Again, some states you can say something different. So we're talking specifically in the US. They even use different lettering in different countries. But for the most part, what you should see is MSW. That only means they have a master's, though. That doesn't mean they're licensed. And so you can get a master's in anything, but if you don't pass the exams and go through the credentialing, you're not licensed. So what I would say, if you're looking for a social worker, and really in that aspect, you're looking for if you've got family systems concerns. Maybe it's, a child that was taken out of a home because of substance use issues. You're working on getting that child back. You're looking at how to bring in systems for support for maybe somebody that's in low income housing and they're trying to navigate food, safety, shelter, these types of things. That's really sort of the bread and butter of predominant social workers. And what you want to look for is an LCSW. The other 2 routes are really family therapy, and then primarily just a counselor. And so there's a licensed marriage and family therapist, so an LMFT. And then the tricky part is, so I'm an LPC in the state of Oregon, a licensed professional counselor. The letters look different depending on what state you're in. So not all states is it listed the same way. For some states, it's a licensed clinical professional counselor. For some states, it's a licensed counselor. Like, it depends on the state that they're in. The key thing for all is to look for licensed. And then the sort of differentiating point between marriage and family versus a regular licensed professional counselor is the focus within a marriage and family program is a lot more on interpersonal dynamics. So there's going to be more emphasis on present day, but also intergenerational dynamics, family systems. There's a bit more there. I can't speak to what their training looks like in terms of trauma. Our training around trauma and what we learn. So basically, we're like the catch-all in between is pretty much what the licensed professional counselor, if you think about it that way, it's like everything that doesn't fall into those two other systems. The problem is there's no way to train everybody to do what they do. And so what you have is, if anyone's familiar with a physician, they go to medical school. That's the same as sort of our master's program, but then they go to residency, and their residency is really where they've selected, this is my specialty. This is where I'm going to learn everything I'm going to learn to really put into practice. My husband's an emergency medicine physician. He had a 3-year residency program where the entire 3 years is about learning how to practice emergency medicine, because straight out of med school, 1, you're not clinically prepared, and 2, you're not prepared for that area. Right. You've got a basic knowledge. Licensed professional counselors, when we leave our master's program, depending on your individual interests, your pursuits, how committed you are, how much time you have to be able to dedicate to it, you're kind of leaving with that same thing.
Okay.
So when I left, I had like I had to pursue eating disorder training, trauma training. Like, you get 1 semester in trauma, really nothing on eating disorders. Like, we don't get that because the program is
so broad.
3 years.
Okay.
Right.
So I have a couple of questions because I'm really trying to make sure that I can create this like blueprint, if you will, for the listener, right? Okay. So what we've talked about so far is when you're looking for a therapist, typically you're looking for somebody that's a licensed clinical social worker, right? Or a licensed professional counselor or a licensed family therapist. What's the difference between that and a psychotherapist?
So depending on clinically, someone that is a psychotherapist or a psychologist, psychotherapist, there's a little bit of gray area, but typically what that means is they have a PhD.
Okay. And so what about a psychologist?
So a psychologist has a PhD, a psychiatrist has a medical degree.
Okay. So guys, get this. A therapist, layman's term, a therapist is a licensed clinical social worker or a licensed professional counselor. Okay. And then those people have master's degrees. And then if you're looking at a psychologist or a psychotherapist, they have a PhD. And if you're looking at a psychiatrist, which is really very different because psychiatry is really about the medication. Okay. Right. They're the ones that can prescribe. And that's why they're an MD. So to Kyira's point, they went through medical school and then their residency was in psychiatry. So now you touched on this. And I really want people to understand this. Like you said, you've got this main general breadth of knowledge, but it doesn't really go deep in any one particular place. And I think what happens, and you and I have talked about this, and I've talked about this on the podcast with other trauma therapists, is that when we get to a place where we're so stuck and we're like, you know what, I really can't do this on my own anymore. I really need some sort of support. The general terminology is you should probably see a therapist. People will go and see a therapist not knowing that there's this breadth and width of knowledge, but not a depth of knowledge. And they assume that everybody's trained in why someone might be stuck. But if someone might be stuck because they have adversity in their background that's left this gaping wound internally that hasn't properly healed, and the therapist hasn't trained specifically in trauma after they've gotten their master's, it may not hit the mark. I'm not saying it won't hit the mark. I'm saying it may not. And the reason why I bring it up is because I see a lot of people, and maybe you do too, Kyira, who have seen therapists And it breaks my heart because the sentiment I get is, I'm so broken, I'm not fixable. There's something so wrong with me because I've been through this therapist or this number of therapists. Nothing's worked for me. And usually what I say is, look, I think therapy is great. I think it's fantastic. We've all been through therapy in my household, but you have to find the right one. And maybe you just haven't found the right support yet. Because there's this understanding, I think, generally in the population that every therapist knows everything. And that if I'm coming to and I'm stuck, and it does have to do with my childhood, that would be something you would just inherently be trained on. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And I do think so there's two layers of it. One, people not necessarily knowing even how to select for what they need. So someone like, we've talked about this in your story. You didn't even know the word trauma until you were 20 years into your therapeutic journey. And so for some people, they don't even know that's what they're looking for. So they're just trying to get in with somebody to start the process. I think the other part of it is our system has made it where you're kind of rolling the dice when you see someone. And when waiting lists are so long, when somebody sees someone, even if it's not perfect, I mean, it's like dating. It's like accepting a teacher you don't like. It's accepting the mechanic that's only so-so. And it's, well, at least I got an appointment. Like I hear this is better than the thing. And so it's that piece of realizing, how do you not fall into that where now you feel so stuck? At least this is here. If you're going to try for someone else, you don't know if you've got a year of trying things out left in you mentally, emotionally. You can't wait another 6 months on a wait list. And so I think for a lot of people, it is one, not maybe knowing what they're looking for, two, struggling with the timeline. And then the third issue is, for most clinicians, not every place is like this. Not every clinician is like this. So I mentioned my two sort of training specialty areas are trauma and eating disorders. And it is so interesting to see the difference between the two. So in the eating disorder realm, nobody's touching it if they're not trained in it. Nobody picks it up. If you come in with an eating disorder and it's a therapist that's not specialized in it, they're like, nope, I can't do it. I'm not for you. You need to see a specialist. There is a very distinct line within the field where people won't take it. I think that's fear because we know it's a very deadly diagnosis. We know that there's a lot there, but there is a distinguished no. I am not trained. Trauma doesn't happen in that same way. And for most people, if you've ever gone to a therapist's website, if you go to like a clinic, go to a private practice clinic, you could even just Google one right now, just any clinic near you and look at all the clinicians and then look at their specialties. Most have 5, 10, 12 things that they're specializing in. You can't specialize in 12 things. So there's this also self-selecting, like I can do anxiety, trauma, personality disorders, depression, all these different elements instead of saying, I'm going to pick one or two. Right. And I'm not going to try to be everything for everyone or feel the pressure to say I can do it all, but instead say, I do this one thing really well. 100%. And if you are looking for this, this is what I'm here for. And that piece, if we could get to that on the professional side, I think that would make the process of finding a therapist a lot easier for people overall. Okay.
So that's an excellent primer. So I'm hoping everybody's taking that in and going, check, 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 check. Now, let's talk specifically about trauma, because as you mentioned, like, we can be a jack of all trades and a master of none, right? Or we can be a master of one. I learned, for me in particular, as a mental health professional, that when it comes to working with my clients, I know what I'm going to put in quotes, niche is. And really what it is people who are interested and curious about how their childhood and how experiences that they had during their developmental years may be impacting them in adulthood. You can call that somebody that specializes in developmental trauma. You can call that somebody who specializes in childhood trauma. You can say that's somebody that specializes in complex PTSD, maybe even. But I am not interested in touching traditional PTSD or, to your point, eating disorders, right? And this is why we do create our own village. And I was just saying to Kyira offsite, like I'm in the process of redoing my website, and part of that website's going to have something called the Village. And the Village is going to be all the other practitioners I trust who have their own specialties too. Right. And where I know I excel is working with specifically developmental trauma, meaning you're an adult and you're ready to address how maybe how you grew up might be impacting the way that you're showing up in the world that's no longer serving you. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about okay, this is a good question. How could somebody, if somebody kind of knows, some people know they have trauma, some people don't. Let's just say for shits and giggles, the person knows, I think this is trauma. What would you recommend? I have some recommendations, but I'm curious, what would you recommend people ask to determine if the practitioner they're looking to work with, whether therapist or coach, is trauma trained, not trauma informed, because there's a big difference,
right?
But trauma trained.
So I have a thought on this. I also want to layer in that piece of, I think one of the issues that we face, because we haven't even brought in the coaching lens yet, because obviously that's the sort of fourth layer of sort of supports when you're coming in. One of the things that I think is really tricky for people also is that, and this is actually unfortunately happening with a lot of therapists too, where people aren't able to use their insurance benefits. And so with coaching, I mean, I have yet to meet a coach who's able to get anything through insurance. No. I was once able to get a program that I did through an HSA plan. Right. And that was, I mean, a lot of effort to get that through. And I'm pretty sure the only reason they did it is because I have those letters after my name, even though it was still technically a coaching program. And so one of the things that I think is also tricky for people is then they're also going, I can't afford this. So I'm also now not able, like my breadth of searching is also a little bit limited. So people oftentimes when they're looking for help are starting at their insurance agencies to find out who's covered by their insurance.
Yeah.
So if somebody, I'm going to answer your question in the ideal setting. If we weren't limited by our insurance, if we weren't limited by money, and we weren't limited by licensures and all those limits and things like that, we're looking at just what would be the ideal situation. I think there are two things that we need to look at when we're bringing somebody. I mean, we know maybe listeners have heard this. I know you said it before, so I'm sure if they've listened to other episodes, there is the like, know, and trust factor. In therapeutic terms, they call it expertness, trustworthiness, attractiveness. So whenever you're thinking about a practitioner, you look at those three things. So expertness is the idea of what's their training? What do they know? What do they have under their belt? Which is where you're kind of hitting at that trauma trained versus trauma informed, because anybody can say they're trauma informed.
Amen.
It's the same thing as anybody can say, literally, you could have read one blog post about food and call yourself a nutritionist. You cannot call yourself a dietitian without actual master's level training. So it's really understanding that term is something anyone can say. So an actual trauma trained therapist will either have, like you have, a much more intensive program with follow-up, with ethical guidelines that are given to you of what you have to follow, a distinction between what you can and can't do in terms of your practice, knowing those limits. If somebody doesn't have training alongside some sort of regulating body, that's where I get nervous with trauma, because sometimes I think what happens, we're humans, that people like, I can take this, I can handle this. And then our ego is there and our shame is there and we don't want to let our clients down and we've got our own scarcity and we end up taking on things that we shouldn't. So what I would say is for someone from that side to look at what their training is and asking some questions around what are some types of cases they've seen before? What are some types of work that they've done before? How have they supported people through trauma recovery? And how have they known when their clients are on the other side? Like, how would we know when we're done? To really get a feel for their process. and to understand what that looks like. And I also think, because I bring this up with clients, because now that I do coaching, I still have people that come to me with disordered eating, body image distress. And I'm like, let's talk about this. There's a line where I can't see you in the coaching side. So I want you to know when I would need to refer out for your safety and support. I'm not leaving. And there are things that I wouldn't necessarily be able to do, and we might need to loop someone in on the team. So also asking some questions around, what would it look like if I needed someone different? What would it look like if we needed to pull somebody on the team? Just asking some general questions, but I do think asking about people they've worked with before. They can't tell you their names and their specific story, but they can tell you, I've worked with people that have had childhood trauma, and here's some of the things that we do. Here's some of the points where I can tell you it's going to get really hard.
Yeah.
And it's going to be super important that, in my case, the conversation has a lot to do with trust. So now we're going into part 2. So that first part, again, questions about their training, their ethical code. I would very much ask about that.
I agree.
And then what that process looks like. Part 2 for trustworthiness, that has to do with your sense of safety and support in the room. We know that feeling safe with the person on the other side is equally, and sometimes, depending on what you're working on, more important than the training. Because if you don't feel safe with them, you're not going to go somewhere with them. Right. And I've had that. We've both had this. We've had therapists that they're like, maybe they were great. I didn't feel seen. I couldn't connect. I didn't talk with them. So the trustworthiness piece is spending some time getting to know them, seeing if you feel good about it. A big thing for me is I'm very direct. I am very blunt. I am also incredibly compassionate. I'm upfront with that right away for potential clients of I'm going to say things you don't like. And I am very hopeful that there are times you don't like me, because that means that I'm holding up the mirror in the places that we need to. And then it's a corrective opportunity for you to be in a space where you get to be mad, sad, feel overwhelmed, feel like you let me down, whatever shame story you have, and then we work through it. So the trustworthiness piece, I think, is, do I like this person? Do I feel safe with this person? Do I trust in again, and this kind of connects to their training, but also just overall, do I feel like I can be in my most vulnerable state with this person and they will hold me in a way that I need them to? And then the third part, and you can see how these all layer in together, but that attractiveness piece or that like piece is sort of another layer of connectedness. So when we're going to go through something hard, and I think about I've had a conversation with a client. I was like, if you can't tolerate the sound of my voice every single week, if I know what I'm talking about, but you feel annoyed at me every time I'm talking, I'm not the right person for you.
And that's
if you don't want to be exactly.
They need to know that we can't be everything for everyone.
And on the opposite side, we don't necessarily want to work with everyone either. We have a hard time being able to say that out loud. And I think that is the other sort of layer of just thinking you're building a relationship. Whether you're on the supporter or the support-e side, this is the most vulnerable and intimate relationship you're going to have, likely, when it comes to a mental and emotional space. So it's interesting to me that we don't have initial consults as a built-in requirement for people. We have them come in and correct.
Yes.
Well, and some therapists do, but it's not required. It's not required for coaches either. There's no regulating body for coaching.
Right.
So there is no, you and I do it because we know the benefit.
Yes.
But most people don't on either side, coaching or therapist.
Right.
It's they're booked in for a slot. They come in, they pay for their time. I'm not giving this away for free. Instead of realizing, gosh, me and that person could be in a long journey of misery if we don't take the 20 minutes now just to see if we even feel safe, comfortable, and like each other enough to want to move forward.
Correct.
And so that was a lot of information, but that kind of is the key piece.
And you're spot on all of it. Coaching specifically is not regulated. You just mentioned that.
Right.
And what I love about the way that my particular school was developed is their thought is, I understand coaching is not regulated and coaching may never be regulated, but trauma recovery coaching should be.
Yeah.
And the way that Bobby developed the school was, I'm going to make the credentialing so stringent that because she's kind of trying to push for regulating the trauma recovery coaching space because she understands how important it is. And should she be able to get that passed, she wants everybody that's ever gone through the training and the school to be able to qualify within a regulatory spot, right? So I appreciate that dramatically. And that's one of the things that makes that kind of training very different than something that's, say, trauma informed, where you're learning how to coach, but you understand how to identify trauma, but you're not really trained on what trauma is per se, right?
Right.
And so, yes to all of it. And I think I'd even add in, if someone's listening and they're feeling a little overwhelmed about like, oh, the credentialing and this, here's a way to keep it simplified. If you're going to meet with a therapist and maybe they don't offer a consultation and you're going to go for the first session, okay? And maybe it's just the way Kyira described it. You're kind of locked into the insurance and who you can get. And okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to ask them a handful of questions that will help you indicate their level of exposure to or knowledge of trauma. One is to ask them what kind of additional training they've had in trauma and from where. Number one. Number two, ask them what their understanding of ACEs is. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it's a study that was done in the 90s that helps people indicate, it's really very much for the medical field to help indicate how some of the environments we grew up in, some of the exposure we had growing up actually has an impact on us much later down the road. Okay. So someone who's definitely trauma trained to the extent is going to have an understanding of what ACEs is. The next is ask them who they follow in the trauma space. And here's some names you might hear. Bessel van der Kolk, Janina Fisher, Gabor Mate. You know, you want to hear, and I'll add in whoever you can think of, Kyira, but you might want to ask them what books would they recommend? What people should you be following to get to know a little bit about the space, and ask them what their exposure is to these people, because that's not that difficult to do. You know, maybe ask them what their favorite book is on understanding trauma. This is going to give you part of the other pieces that Kyira answered, which is this likability and connectability and trust. Because now you're going to be able to see if that person's really guarded with that information, or if it kind of just like really super easily flows off their tongue and they almost can't talk enough about it, right? Would you agree?
Yeah. And I was going to say, and I made a handout. I didn't even think about this handout a long time ago for clients to like find the right therapist. I'll send it to you so we can put it in the show notes.
Thanks.
I do think one of the things that happens that I think is interesting too, is a lot of the times we don't realize that we are consumers. Like, if you're looking for a therapist, if you're looking for a dentist, if you're looking for a contractor, those people work for you. And there's a basic semblance of respect on both sides. But I think what people forget within the medical side of things, and again, I'm putting mental health under that umbrella, is that we get to choose that we have the power in that space. And so I think the questions you're asking them to think about, it feels hard because it feels like I'm one down. I'm more powerless. Like, that's the expert in the room. And so I think part of what Stacey and I are saying too is you are not the one down. Like, you are in the position of power. Your story, you are the expert on your life, and you're looking for somebody to work for and with you in that. And I think if you notice in those moments, because I'll feel that when someone asks questions, sometimes I'll feel that sense of like throat tightness, that sense of like almost resistance, because I'm feeling like I'm being challenged in a way that feels threatening. And that is not mean that what they're doing is threatening. That's a me thing to sort through. And so you also get a chance to kind of experience how somebody responds to maybe being, perceived as being challenged, or to be put in that position to have those conversations, instead of just assuming, well, I'm here and I've got the credentials, and so I deserve your business. And so I think this is a really great way to get a handle on that. Because one of the things I also think we forget is that the coaching, the therapist relationship is also iterative. So I've had people where we were great in the beginning and then we hit a wall. And sometimes that means we need to change what we're doing. Sometimes that means they need somebody else. But if that client is not comfortable giving me feedback, either as a coach or as a therapist, we're going to get stuck. And so really one of the things too to think about is as I'm asking questions and I'm sort of taking up space in the room, does that feel safe for me with this other person? Because what happens when I need to give them feedback that I think that they're focusing on something that doesn't feel right for me right now, or I really want to go somewhere else, or the way they're asking me to do things doesn't feel good, or I feel like we're stuck and we're not getting somewhere. And so all that to say, I like what you're bringing up. And I think these questions are super important. And again, I have this handout that we can give people
Perfect.
so they can add some of those in there too, to really get a feel for, ultimately, who's the right person for you, not who's the right person to talk about trauma, who's the right person for you and your story to talk about your trauma, to talk about your healing. And that person may or may not put trauma in their title. But I think, like you said, it's learning, like, what's my why for wanting to enter into this relationship? And is this other person skilled, safe, and likable enough for me to do that with?
Yeah. So I do have other questions for you. I don't know if we want to bring that into another episode. And the question I have for you is, you've mentioned a few times that you both coach and do therapy. And I've met a number of therapists that are now dipping their toe into both. Yep. And I think that that's really awesome. And I think it's worth discussing. So, Kyira Wackett, are we continuing here, or are we going for another episode so we can talk about the difference between therapy and coaching?
I mean, I think the amount that we know is there. I think we're like priming ourselves for an episode 4. And I think we're coming into it that way and thinking about, so what does that look like to, we can talk about why I made the decision, why I know other people do. And I've had the opportunity to talk to other therapists that now, because of, I think, sort of the way that coaching was talked about in many of our training programs, it feels like we're like a step down when it's not. So a lot of people have some internalized bias around it, some like selling out, some ideas because it's now you're not taking insurance if you're doing coaching. So I think there's a lot we could tease apart. Yeah. And I think adding in your layer of just, you took that path specifically, you didn't go exactly. It's going to be interesting to talk through those two. And again, just holding space for both. And I'll be very honest about why I don't love therapy as much as I love coaching for some of the work that I do and the client pieces that I have. And so,
love it.
Yeah, I think we're primed for a part 4.
Cool.
Cliffhanger. Cool. Yeah.
All right, guys, we dumped a lot on you in 35 minutes, but it's, I love my podcast because I'm doing what I feel called to do. It's very much in alignment with me, which is I'm trying to give you roadmaps. I'm trying to give you roadmaps to who you are through storytelling. I'm trying to give you roadmaps to how you can feel better within your own life. Even if you can't work with me, even if you can't work with Kyira, there's so much value that we can offer. And I think we both have that in our alignment, that we want to offer easy, consumable pieces of information that can help you make the right decisions for your healing journey. And today's a really great episode on that, because there are a lot of paths and it can be very overwhelming and it can be confusing. So I'm really hoping that you walked away today just learning a little bit about the ins and outs and the nuances of the industry as a whole. Right? And these silos, remember, you've got therapists, you've got psychologists and psychotherapists, you've got psychiatrists in this one bundle. And then you've also got coaching, which we're going to talk about in episode 4, and how to find the right therapist for you and what's inherently part of a curriculum and what is not, right? So I think we did a great primer there. Is there anything you want to add, Kyira, to just wrap it up?
No, I think you did a great job re-summarizing it. Just empowering people to get that handout and then make it their own, edit it, add the questions you brought in, change it up to make it work for them. But again, to really take that of, I'm interviewing somebody that they get the opportunity to work with me. It's a privilege to do that, to hold somebody's story. Exactly.
Voice and choice.
Awesome.
It's yours. All right, guys. If you like the podcast, you want to subscribe because I drop a new one every single Monday. Until then, take care.